Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the co-founder and CEO of Sano, and I'm here with Alastair Kent, who's a world leader in policy development and patient engagement for rare disease. He's part of a number of different groups nationally here in the UK, across Europe, as well as internationally, working to improve support for families and research in rare disease. Welcome, Alistair, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. I was wondering if you could start by just telling us some of your story, what caused you to have a passion for rare disease and get involved in this in the first place?
It was a variety of reasons. I started my career in the disability field many years ago, and even at that time, in a sense, the end of disability work was not a question. Nobody felt that disabled people should not have full human and civil rights and be able to participate in society to the fullest extent possible. The question was about means rather than ends. But in the genetics, in the rare disease field, we were just at the beginning of an era where the end was not clear, because yesterday's science fiction was potentially today's Nature paper and tomorrow's clinical service improvements. So the big question was, how can we capture the knowledge that was beginning to be generated through advances in molecular genetics and use that for the benefit of patients and families living with intractable and unacceptable long-term medical conditions that were in many cases life-limiting.
And what have been the main shifts that you've seen over the course of your career?
I think the opportunity to understand what's going on has been absolutely astonishing in the way that it has advanced. 25, 30 years ago, clinical genetics was an obscure corner of the health service, populated by a very small number of highly intelligent and research-orientated clinicians. And although it's a caricature, it was kind of seen as the place that pediatricians sent the families to that they didn't understand and couldn't do anything for. And clinical genetics, in some cases, was able to give a diagnosis, but in many cases was not. But there was that expectation that by contributing samples to research, that families would be able to advance knowledge. And that family professional partnership, which was, I think, a very strong element in the early days of genetic medicine, actually laid the basis for much of the progress that we've seen in the 25 or so years since that.
Yeah, so it reminds me of, there's a meeting in London every year called the Dysmorphology meeting, where a group of clinical geneticists get together and still discuss these most challenging cases. And back when this meeting was beginning, it was about looking at pictures and trying to actually look from the face or from other features of the body what's going on. But today there's a huge infusion of genetics into it, where you have not just the physical features, but also what information is coming or hasn't, or what isn't in the genetic test.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And even in terms of looking at pattern recognition, which of course is what dysmorphology is, we're getting advances in technology that will allow machine learning and artificial intelligence to work with the dysmorphologist to improve the likelihood of an accurate diagnosis from physical features.
Right. So on the topic of accurate diagnosis, I know you've been part of the 100,000 Genomes project here in the UK, run by Genomics England. Would you mind just, for people who aren't aware, describing that project? I know we've talked about it on the podcast before, but in case it's someone's first episode, what is the goal of the project and where is it today?
Yeah. Well, the 100,000 Genomes project was initiated by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. And he set the ambitious goal of sequencing 100,000 whole genomes in the field of rare diseases and cancer in 5 years. And at the time, it was a hugely ambitious goal.
Seemed impossible.
It seemed impossible. We didn't have the technology, we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have the people to do it. But thanks to the sort of spirit, it was a kind of can-do spirit. There was a large amount of money being offered by the NIHR to make this happen. And although some people felt, well, this isn't perhaps the right way to go about doing it, this was what was on offer, and you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. So you got a coming together of scientists and clinicians partnering with industry, with companies like Illumina, to try and make it happen. And in the first instance, obviously, it started out slowly. There were things that needed to be done in order to make the sequencing technically possible. For example, cancer surgeons had to stop taking samples and fixing them in formalin. They had to be turned to fresh frozen samples. And so getting changes in clinical practice, changes in organizational methods and so on, took time. But gradually that sort of built up, and the expertise was generated. The facilities, the analysis centre at Hingston, at the Sanger Centre, all those bits came together. And by the time the end of the 5-year period was coming, the, as it were, diagnosis rate, the hit rate for diagnosis for rare diseases was in the order of about 30%. Right. And because the samples are continuously re-evaluated as new information comes to light, then that percentage can only increase as we go on. And that makes a huge difference to families, because most of those coming forward to volunteer, to donate samples, without the 100,000 genomes, would have been extremely unlikely to receive an accurate diagnosis of the problem, possibly even ever.
Right, and I think the other thing to note about this 30% figure is the vast majority of those participants had already been subjected to a lot of different types of testing. This is the last resort.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, effectively, you didn't get on to the 100,000 genomes unless you'd reached that point. And that's right and proper, because if there is a conventional, clinically valid diagnostic tool that works for you, then you should have access to that quickly. The 100,000 genomes was research, is research. So if you like, the validity of the information that emerges needs to be proven before it can be used to actually help make clinical decisions or management decisions for individuals and families.
And I also think a really unique part of this project has been the level of patient involvement from the very beginning. And I know that's something you work a lot on. Can you speak a little bit about how has the 100,000 Genomes project been different than many of the projects that come before it?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of rhetoric about patient engagement. It's clearly seen as a good thing to do, in heavy inverted commas. And indeed, if you were to turn around and say, well, actually, I'm a scientist, what can patients tell me? Right. I only deal with things at the level of base pairs. There's nothing that a patient can add there. People would look at you and say, I think you've lost the plot.
You need to reevaluate.
Yes, because it is clear that the insights that patients and families can bring to the understanding of the condition can help to elucidate the data, turn data into information, turn information into knowledge, turn knowledge into action that will change the lives of those affected ultimately. Now, it's not an immediate process, but what the 100,000 genomes program said right from the start was that this is not a kind of helicopter model where, we scientists, we clinicians, we technicians drop in, scoop up the samples and disappear to our ivory tower in the middle of the Cambridgeshire countryside. This is a partnership. And that partnership was about how can we build the knowledge that is going to make clinical service improvements in the NHS and elsewhere in the world a real possibility, sustainably and within an acceptable time frame. So by engaging with patients, by looking at the recruitment procedures, the information that was provided, the support they were given, the opportunities for patients and family members to participate in real decision making about the future direction, about who should be allowed to access the data once it was generated and under what circumstances, really meant that there was, I think, a degree of cohesion between the different stakeholders that was certainly more uncommon in other areas of research than I would have liked to have seen it.
So on this point about data access, I think it'd be great to go into more detail around this, because that has been an area where this particular project has been incredibly careful about making sure that everything is done by the book, that data is not being shuttled around the internet without anyone knowing what's going on. Can you speak a little bit about what's the best practice, or what's the been done in this area?
I think one of the things that emerged in the early days of the 100,000 genomes, and indeed in some of its predecessor projects like DDD, diagnosing developmental delay, was the fact that patients and families are incredibly willing to share their information with people who have, as it were, a legitimate need to know.
Right.
They don't want to see it squirted around the internet and
used for advertising,
plastered all over Facebook and all the rest of it. So that willingness to share is based on a degree of trust.
Right.
And I think 100,000 genomes, right from the start, was very aware of the need to maintain that trust. It takes a long time to build trust, and you can fritter it away in a second by carelessness or lack of thought. So in trying to maximize the opportunity to add value through the sequencing, it was very important that that patients were understood the consent process that they were embarking upon, and realized that they actually did have a degree of control over the uses to which their data was put. It was a research project, but they could opt out. But they could only opt out of future applications. They couldn't change the past and have their, if their data had been used, it had been used.
Right.
But it had been used in an anonymized fashion, so there was no personal identification possible. So first of all, there was the question of consent and people's understanding of that consent. But also there was built into the system was the voice of patients, patient representatives on the Ethical Advisory Committee, which oversaw the running of the 100,000 genomes from an ethical point of view, and which was reported directly to the Board of Management for Genomics England. There were patient representatives on the Access Review Committee, and that committee sort of scrutinized the proposals coming forward for use of the data as it was generated, and said yes or no. Yes, this is an appropriate use. This is within the terms of reference of the original consent, or no, it's not. This is a sensible use of a finite resource, or this is actually a bit of a punt in the dark and probably needs further work before we'll consider it, and so on. So at each stage of the process, the voice of the end user, the patient, was there at the table in a full voting capacity. They weren't observers.
Right.
They were members.
It wasn't tokenism. It's really full involvement.
Yeah. And it was it is remarkable how engaged and how informed people who might have, at first glance, been thought perhaps not to have the insight of the experience to add to the dimension. That's completely not the case.
Yep.
The patient voice, the family voice, has significantly shaped, as it were, the tone, in inverted commas, of the decision-making process. And as a result, I think certainly in the rare disease community, there is a feeling that it has been a proper partnership program. And seeing that now as the 100,000 genomes data collection phase, as it were, comes to an end and we shift to a genomic medicine service in the NHS, that, as it were, spirit of partnership and the recognition that clinical management and research go hand in hand.
Right.
They are two sides of the same coin in many respects, is actually, I think, an important development that bodes well for the future of genomics research in the NHS in the UK.
Right. I think the idea that you no longer have to wait a decade to go from discovery or diagnosis to a clinical trial or to a research project means hopefully that the pace of research in these underserved areas can increase, right?
Yeah. And of course, now that we can do whole genome sequencing affordably, I mean, it's the sequencing is not a significant
probably
cost.
A quarter or a third of the cost when you build in personnel and interpretation.
But that relative cheapness, makes the possibility of doing things at scale feasible. And of course, it's only by generating huge volumes of data that you begin to see patterns and you begin to be able to draw inferences that will stand up to scrutiny and ultimately become clinically useful as part of a medical care program.
And now my understanding is the ambition is to now set a new goal of 5 million genomes.
Yeah.
Not all whole genomes necessarily, but in rare disease specifically, there's going to be guaranteed whole genome sequencing for any child with an undiagnosed pediatric disorder. So from this perspective, it seems like the project has been an incredible success. Otherwise, we wouldn't be building on top of it.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Obviously, if there is, as it were, a recognized diagnostic test for a suspected condition, then that will be done first. But the offer of whole genome sequencing for any child without an obvious diagnosis, I think, will be hugely significant for families, and it's something that we should welcome.
Amazing.
And going back to the start of this conversation, if you had said to me 25, 30 years ago, this is what we're going to do, I'd have laughed at you.
Yeah.
This was beyond the wildest imagination of even the most forward-thinking enthusiast. Right. You could not have conceived that this would be a realistic possibility in such a short time frame.
Right, and if you we can post maybe a picture of this graph, but the graph that everyone uses all the time of the price of genome sequencing from 2000 to the present day. It was $100 million for a genome in 2001. Even in 2006 or 2005, 2006, it was tens of thousands of dollars per genome. So the idea of doing 100,000 or 1 million or 5 million, like you say, was just, there's not enough money in the country to do it, right? But the price at the scale that the 100,000 Genomes Project and now the Genomic Medicine Service is doing it, it's hundreds of dollars for a whole genome, no longer thousands.
And it's not just the price, although obviously the fact that the price has fallen through the floor is significant. The technology that now delivers that as a matter of routine was similarly unimaginable 25 or 30 years ago. You could not conceive, at that point, our opportunity to sequence a gene was a hugely laborious process. It was basically using technology that had been familiar to scientists for a long time.
Bacterial, artificial chromosomes, and yeast chromosomes and things,
Yeah, and the idea that you could do what we can do now, I mean, people would have laughed at you. It's just not possible.
I'd like to ask a little more about this data access and the access review piece of the project, because it seems to me that there are now, I think, 25 different national genomics programs. There's one in Ireland, there's one in Singapore, there's been one in Estonia for a long time, there's a big one in the US. Some of them have come under fire. In Ireland, for example, there's a huge debate raging right now of what is the appropriate involvement of industry money into these national programs. But it seems to me like the Genomics England and the 100,000 Genomes has threaded this in terms of public opinion and how it's done really well, and that there haven't been any huge concerns about the way data is being handled. What is it actually that this program has done right that has enabled it to kind of get the industry involvement that means you can bring medicines to market better, but also not have patients or other people concerned that you're making data available in the wrong way, or selling access to a national treasure or something like that?
Yeah, I think what has been clear from the start with 100,000 genomes is that this is a public sector, an NHS related piece of work. It's, although obviously private sector organizations have played a significant part, it has been clear from the outset that private sector organizations will only be able to use the data under carefully controlled situations and for particular applications. And also that they won't be allowed, as it were, to take the data away. I think the model that Mark Caulfield came up with right at the start, that this is a reading library, not a lending library. I think it's a perfect metaphor. Is a brilliant metaphor. So you can go in, you can look at it, you can manipulate it within the context of a secure repository. You can take the knowledge that you've generated out and do stuff with it, but you can't actually privatize the data and own it. It belongs ultimately to the person from whom it was collected. And there was a similar concern a few years ago with a project funded by the Wellcome Trust called the HapMap project, which was looking at population genotypes in discrete populations around the world. And there again, there was the fear that industry would come in, would take the data out of a public database, manipulate it a bit, and effectively slap a patent on it. So the Wellcome Trust, which obviously has been hugely important and engaged with 100,000 genomes alongside NHS and NIHR and so on, developed a model to prevent that from happening. But I think it was that early thinking that was put in that alerted Genomics England to the importance of creating a model that sustained trust and prevented undue exploitation of knowledge for private gain at the expense of those from whom the data originated and for whom the data was ultimately intended to benefit.
Yeah, I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about this later as well in the context of pricing around some of the new treatments for rare disease, because hand in hand with improved research and diagnostic comes new therapies, but the sheer cost and the amount of time that it takes to bring these new treatments to market means that often the price tags are shocking. So maybe we can pick up on that later. I just wanted to ask, besides the 100,000 genomes that we've talked a lot about that, but you've also been a part of the leadership for Genetic Alliance. And I think you've just changed to a new role there now. But would you mind telling us a little bit about Genetic Alliance and what you did there to work on kind of bringing patients again to the forefront of research?
Yeah. Well, Genetic Alliance UK is the UK umbrella group for patient and family support groups for those with rare and genetic diseases. It was founded in 1990. It was registered as a charity, and it came about because people working in condition-specific patient organisations came together in order to lobby to support the adoption of the first Human Fertilisation Embryology Act.
Right.
In that act, there was provision for human embryo research under tightly defined circumstances and with full ethical control. The Act, or the bill as it was then, came under a sustained attack from some of the so-called pro-life groups. And representatives of patient organisations felt that the opportunity to do ethical research on human embryos was an important tool for advancing understanding into what were then, and in many cases today still are, incurable lethal diseases of childhood. So they formed what was then called the Genetic Interest Group as a way of coordinating the lobbying, the advocacy to support the bill. Initially, just as a single-issue campaign.
Right.
They were successful. The bill became the law. The Act enabled the setting up of the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority. And those people basically had a, well, that was fun, what should we do now moment.
What's the next problem?
Gosh, that really works. It was clear that by working together, you could create a critical mass that made a problem visible. Many of the conditions that the organisations that are part of Genetic Alliance UK, as it's now called, have maybe a dozen, maybe fewer affected families across the whole of the UK. And if you go to the Secretary of State for Health and say, what are you going to do today about people with XYZ disorder, the first question is always going, well, how many are we talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Well,
100 in the country?
Less than that. Yeah. Okay, fine. Well, no, that's a great tragedy, and I'm very sorry for you, but I'm not going to do much for you. However, if you say, right, there are 6,000, 8,000 rare conditions, that affects, thousands of children. If you go to any pediatric ward in any district hospital, you'll see that half the beds are occupied with children who are there because of the consequences of a genetic disease. Half of all childhood deaths, more or less, result from genetic diseases in this country. Thousands of children a year. The other the other cause of severe childhood ill health is impact with hard objects at high speed.
Right.
But then it becomes a visible problem. You have a critical mass. You look at the expenditure from the NHS on that group of children, and you'll find, although in absolute terms the numbers are small, in terms of the bandwidth of NHS resource that they use up, it is very significant.
Right.
And it makes sense to try and make sure that the money you are spending is achieving the best possible clinical outputs and the greatest possible improvements in the life of children and families who are affected.
Yep.
So the rationale behind the work of Genetic Alliance UK was to try and bring that policy focus to politicians, to industry, to the academic and the clinical community in a way that they could see and recognise. It's going along the route of moving from anecdote to a trend to evidence to action.
Right.
By finding the commonalities, by making the voice of the patient, the family heard in a way that people can understand, people can listen to, people can see what can be done. It's no use going to the Secretary of State or the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company or whatever and saying, I'm suffering, something must be done. Because the Secretary of State, the CEO, will say, millions of people are suffering. Tell me what you want me to do,
right,
and I'll consider it. Tell me the difference it will make, and I'll see what I can do. You have to present the
full package, right? Yeah.
Or your thoughts in a way that people can understand what you're seeking. And what Genetic Alliance UK strove to do, still strives to do, is to make sure that the voice of those ultimately affected by rare and genetic conditions is heard and respected, because it is seen to be, if you like, a reasonable voice, a fair voice, and an informed voice.
Right. So how do you go about doing that? Is it a combination of raising awareness, lobbying directly to governments, in the UK, Europe, or further afield, or what are the I'm sure it's a multi-pronged strategy.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, obviously, you plan your strategy to some extent on a case-by-case basis. Right. We were very involved, have been very involved in a number of European-level initiatives, bringing about the introduction of the Orphan Medicinal Products Regulations, the Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products Regulations, which are used to determine the process by which new drugs, new interventions are brought to the market, with the confidence of patients that they do what they say on the tin, and that what they say on the tin actually relates to the situation that patients and families find themselves in. We were very involved in the work that brought about the development of ERNs, expert reference networks, because no matter, even in the bigger nation states of Europe, there is insufficient expertise to provide a high quality service to all patients affected by any rare disease.
Right.
So it's one of the key ways in which being part of the European Union has added value to enable that expertise to be shared around the whole of the European Union, supporting local clinicians to build up their own expertise, and where specialist expertise or resources are needed, enabling patients and families to travel to that centre of expertise wherever it is within the European Union.
Right. So are the ERNs, just because I'm somewhat familiar with them but not an expert, are they physical locations, or are they virtual sort of supranational networks of experts across the EU?
It's a bit of both. There are 24 ERNs clustering rare diseases, so rare neurological, rare kidney diseases, and so on.
Epilepsy.
Yeah. And the idea is that you have centres of expertise which meet certain criteria. You can't self-declare as a.
Can't declare as a centre
I'm an
of
expert.
excellence.
I work in a centre, therefore it's a centre of expertise.
Right.
You can't self-declare. You have to meet eligibility criteria, which you have to be research active. You have to have a certain critical mass of patients. You have to, demonstrate that you are, know what you're talking about. Yeah. And the idea is that these approved centres of excellence, centres of expertise, are networked together across the European Union to share existing good practice and also to build better practice in the future. and to stimulate research. So, they are physical centres, but they are also networks that transcend national boundaries. The intention is that it will be the knowledge and the expertise that travels wherever possible, but that it is also, if you need something specific that can't be provided,
can also be the family that travels.
The family can travel to the, to the centre, and the UK played a major part in them. Disproportionately, our expertise in the UK was greater than that of other member states, even the large ones like France or Germany or whatever. And indeed, if we do leave the European Union at the end of October without a deal, I think one of the great losses, both to UK patients and to European patients, will be the loss of engagement from UK expertise in building best practice for patients and families.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like patients with rare disorders are likely to suffer the most, or at least disproportionately from a Brexit or a no-deal Brexit where there's no plan in place, because if you have 20 people in the UK or 5 people in the UK, then there's no hope without banding together across Europe or hopefully internationally.
Yes, yeah. I have to say, I hope you're wrong, but I fear you're right. And that would be a great shame. I mean, for patients and families, pan-European collaboration has made more progress possible more quickly than would have been the case had we simply worked on our own as separate nations.
One of the other, I think, quite transformative things in the last decade, both in the US and in Europe, has been the orphan drug legislation. Would you mind explaining a little bit how that came about and what that means for patients that have rare conditions that fall under these categories, as well as the research in this area? Yeah.
Well, as you know, it's the private sector that makes drugs. And in order to sustain innovation, in order to continue producing novel therapies for unmet medical needs, there needs to be the opportunity for a return on the investment, whether it's dividends to shareholders or payback to venture capitalists or whatever. Now, it had been clear for a long time in the US in the 1980s. They introduced the Orphan Drug Act to stimulate interest in the opportunity of developing drugs that would not otherwise be commercially viable, because the patient population was too small, the cost of development was too high, and the resulting price per patient of the therapy would be astronomical. Right. So in the US, they introduced the Orphan Drugs Act, which introduced a number of incentives, and that clearly worked. It stimulated an upsurge of interest and investment, and produced a number of innovative therapies that undoubtedly would not otherwise have come to market. The European Union was behind the curve on this. And in the 1990s, it was, and earlier than that, it was clear that there was very little interest in developing interventions for small patient populations. But there was concerted advocacy, lobbying by patients, by industry, and by some academics and clinicians to have a matching regime, shall we say, on this side of the Atlantic. And the European Parliament and the European Commission was persuaded that this was a good idea. So the Commission set about developing a set of regulations, the Orphan Medicinal Products Regulations, that would provide broadly comparable incentives for R&D on this side of the Atlantic to those that existed on the other side of the Atlantic. So it, for example, gave 10 years of market exclusivity if you got a successful product, which meant that nobody could bring a similar product for the same indication to the market whilst you had that exclusivity. It gave exemption from fees charged by the Medicines Agency for considering your proposal, your dossier. It provided access to protocol assistance and scientific advice. So you could work out what evidence you needed to generate in order to satisfy the regulators that your product was safe and effective, and you could produce it to an acceptable standard. And it meant, and you had to demonstrate that it was actually, as it were, a clear, identifiable condition that you were seeking to address, not an artificially defined subset of a more common condition. So the regulations were adopted remarkably quickly for the European Union, and they became law in 2000. And because it was a regulation, it applied immediately across the whole of the European Union. It wasn't a directive that needed to be adopted into national law. And since then, we have seen, sustained interest in companies coming forward, seeking orphan designation in order that they can get the support to take their idea forward in a way that is most likely to be successful. And I think it's interesting here because I think I was one of the Orphan Medicine Products Committee was the first European Medicines Agency scientific committee to have patient members, full members, on alongside the usual representatives of the national competent authorities, of the commission, of the agency, and so on. And I was one of those first three members. And I think one of the things that we managed to do was, if you like, to change the tone of the committee. The final licensing committee is the CHMP, the Committee for Human Medicinal Products. And they are, if you like, the guarantors of probity. They want to make sure that you have done your research properly, that you have asked the questions you should have asked, and that you're telling everything that you know that is relevant. So, they take a tough, suspicious, conservative with a small c approach. Now, that was what the members of the national competent authorities, that was the approach they were used to. But one of the things I think we as patient representatives were able to do was to say, hang on, there's plenty, it's difficult enough to do the research and to prove that you've got a good scientific rationale that will deliver health gain. If you put the hurdle too high at the start, then you're actually going to frustrate the intention of the legislation. The aim of the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, the COMP, should be to see if the idea is a good one. Is there a scientific rationale? And is it sensible, the approach that is suggested to testing it out? So if the idea has got legs, we should be helping it to walk.
Give it a try,
Yeah, we shouldn't be aiming to cut the legs out from under it before it gets started. And I think that has been an important way in which patient input has directly changed the process and resulted in, I think, a very successful piece of legislation continuing to generate interest and investment and encourage companies to get involved in developing innovative therapies for small populations with rare diseases.
Right. I mentioned this earlier, some of the questions around price. So especially in the last 5 years or so, there have been a number of amazing transformative therapies, the CAR T therapies in cancer. Recently, there's new therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. There've been quite a lot of discussion here in the UK around the cystic fibrosis drugs, for example. What can you explain the challenge and the problem a little bit, and maybe how you see as a way, what is the solution for $1 million drug that actually cures devastating condition that might actually cost much more than $1 million to the NHS over the life of a patient, but it's got such a high sticker price to start with.
Yeah. I think it's important to look at why things have some interventions have a high price. I mean, in many cases, a high price may be a fair price.
Right.
But obviously, one wouldn't support efforts by companies, as it were, to gouge the price,
or something like that.
to deliver the maximum possible short-term gain, and hang the consequences, as it were. It's very difficult for a company. I mean, a large multinational pharma company will have a very different set of financial drivers from a small startup burning its initial tranche of VC funding in the desperate hope to get to the point where you can get more money or become part of something bigger. So it's difficult for companies to think beyond their own, as it were, immediate strategic objectives. But I think what we have to do is to try and find new ways of perhaps of risk sharing, new ways of rewarding innovation that are sustainable. We see in the NHS the emergence of market access schemes where payment or sustained payment is dependent on proof of progress, continued progress. And that's one way of doing it. Where the company, the NHS, agree a process for developing the information that will allow for the determination of the added value that comes from utilizing the therapy. But those are expensive to operate. They're time consuming, and they can bring difficulties with them. If, for example, you look at gene therapy for severe combined immune deficiency, which has been used for about 15 years now in an experimental, in a hospital-based setting. It's given to babies at birth, shortly after birth, as soon as diagnosis, and then they are no longer children with severe combined immune deficiency. They're just children, and but you don't know that that's going to be the case at the point at which you give them the therapy. So you have to take a degree of trust, but equally, you need to be able to avoid just simply frittering away scarce resources.
Track that progress, trust but verify, I suppose, is the... Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we need to be more creative in ways in which we add value or determine the added value. And we need to break out of the kind of short-term approach that dominates the discussion today. And also, I think we need to try and find ways of enabling companies to take a broader societal perspective as well as a short-term financial one. I mean, the only reason that companies are allowed to develop therapies which are often pretty toxic, if they're used in the wrong way, and put these therapies into our bodies, is because we have a societal contract, a social contract, and a regulatory framework that gives patients and families confidence that
these things have been
properly tested and evaluated. And ultimately, the funding to allow that to happen, to allow the R&D to happen, to allow the licensing process, to allow for the return on investment, comes from you and me, comes from the taxes we pay that go into the health service, that the health service then use to make resource allocation decisions. And we as individuals, as citizens, ultimately need to be confident that although you can't have everything you want, the system is geared up in such a way that you are likely to be able to get what you need when there is something there that works and would benefit you. So I think we need to kind of restructure the conversation about the relationship between the bottom line in financial terms and the bottom line in societal terms. Because let's face it, as we get older, the chances of us acquiring a serious medical condition increase. And I don't know about you, but I would quite like, when it happens to me, for there to be an effective intervention that will address the problem, and B, that it will be available to me in a timely way such that I'm likely to be able to get it and benefit from it. So it's in all our interests, whether we have a rare genetic condition that's apparent from birth or a later onset condition, the things that affect us all as we get older, that we find a way of sustaining investment, of continuing to produce innovative therapies that address real patient needs in a sustainable and affordable way. And as we get our aging population with increasing comorbidities, the need to find a way of doing that without excluding those people who do depend on highly expensive, innovative interventions for small populations from the process is ever more urgent.
Yeah, and I think you also mentioned that actually making sure we're in tune with the real problems of the patient and what we're solving, and I feel like there's the term real-world evidence or patient-generated health data is often used, and I feel like this is a crucial part of this equation, which is, like you say, you administer a therapy at one point, but I'd really like to know for the course of that patient's life, or for a 10-year period, how well is it actually working, and are there things that it's not, or are there people that it's not working on, or are there things that it's not solving that we could do? And I feel like there's an opportunity to actually, we have digital technologies, we have a way for patients to stay connected, that actually gathering some of this information, integrating it with the more traditional healthcare system and the genetic testing data that we've talked about is maybe a way that we can start to get a feedback loop on, are these expensive therapies working, who are they working for, and how can we improve?
Yes, I mean, unlike possibly any other sector of the healthcare communities, patients and families have absolutely no interest in therapies that don't work. The NHS still spends a large amount of money doing things that have no clinical benefit, but because of the inertia of the system, things just keep rolling
and they just don't
around.
know in some cases.
Well, quite yes, they don't have the evidence, but so it's important, I think, to make sure that the experience, the insights of patients and families are reliably captured and used to alter clinical practice. If a drug's not going to work for you, then don't take it. But you need to know as a patient that the drug doesn't work for you, not that it's too expensive or the system has failed to identify that you would be one who would benefit, or all these other things. So there's a question of confidence and a question of engagement. But I think there's also, we all know it doesn't matter whether you've got a cold or whether you've got a life-limiting disease. There are some aspects of that illness that really spoil your day, and some things you can live with. Right. They're a nuisance, and you wish they weren't there, but you can get on with life.
Yeah.
So if someone is going to develop a therapy that might cost 6 or 7 figures per patient to deliver, it really is important to make sure that it will address the things that spoil your day,
right,
rather than the things that you can live with. Because that way you're more likely to get it through the regulatory process, through the health technology assessment that's there, and B, because it will actually make the health gain that patients and families are looking for much more achievable.
Right.
We all want a miracle bullet that will cure the problem, take it away forever, and just render us healthy and whole again. But we know that that's unlikely to happen. So, therapies should be deliberately targeted on those areas which will make the biggest difference.
Right. So a couple of blue skies questions before we finish off here. Just wondering if you're willing to make any predictions for the next decade. So sitting here in 2019 and 2029 or 2030, how do you think the way we'll diagnose and treat rare conditions will change?
Now this is the
no pressure.
No pressure there.
I'll check in 10 years and see how it fares.
Yes. Who was it who said prediction is difficult, especially when it's about the future?
Yeah.
So I may be well off beam here. In fact, I almost certainly will be. But I think looking ahead, we will undoubtedly see a significant advance in our ability to understand and diagnose diseases at the molecular level. It shouldn't be underestimated the uniqueness of the situation we are in today in that respect. If you think about it, Homo sapiens has been around as a species for something like 200,000 years. Right. And it's only certainly in our lifetime that we have had the opportunity to understand at the molecular level the processes that go wrong,
right,
and that result in life-limiting diseases. So having the opportunity to have that insight, because once you understand at the molecular level, you can start thinking about changing things, about how to alter the machinery. You can get into things and make a difference. So that is a unique opportunity that, as people alive today, has been denied to all of our forebears, right back to the earliest emergence of Homo sapiens at the edge of the Olduvai Gorge in the Rift Valley in Africa. So I think the challenge for us is to capitalize on that knowledge in ways that benefit humanity. Right. We see unanticipated consequences. The emergence of over-the-counter genetic testing is without, as it were, a proper framework of information around it, and support for those people who choose to go down that route, can potentially have quite devastating consequences. There have been a number of stories recently in the press about people who went down the over-the-counter genetic testing route and found that they were their social parent was not their biological parent,
and
with devastating consequences for the family. So, there are threats, there are challenges.
Right.
The threat of, as it were, unauthorized access to sensitive genetic information needs to be guarded against and protected. You cannot eliminate the risk of that happening, but we do need a regulatory framework that says, if you get unauthorized access to my data and you use it for a purpose which is illicit, then you will get thoroughly kicked in such a way that you will not be able to do it again. So we need to protect the consequences of protect against the consequences of abuse. You can never make a completely secure system that is unhackable, but you need to make the opportunities to benefit from illicit use as unattractive as you possibly can.
Right.
Yeah. So, looking to the future, I think we will need to see a greater imagination in the way in which we regulate and permit uses of our sensitive information. We'll need to see more imaginative thinking about how we take those new opportunities and turn them into health gain for people living under currently awful circumstances. And although we've made huge progress in the last 20 years, there's still an awful long way to go. If we've come, say, 20 miles on a journey, we don't know if we're on a journey of 30 miles or 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
We still have got an awful lot of diseases which we cannot reliably diagnose, which we don't understand, which we can't do more than palliate the symptoms of while nature takes its course. So, there's a huge lot still to be done. And I don't think the challenge is unachievable, but there needs to be a sustained commitment to pursuing the goal, which I think is a real one and a worthwhile one, but also in the context of the other challenges we face. The threat of pandemics that are untreatable with our current level of antimicrobials. The impact of climate change causing widespread social disruption. And if that happens, of course, it will be people who are dependent on highly expensive, innovative interventions who will be uniquely vulnerable.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. I had one more question, which I'm curious to get your thoughts on. If you were starting your career all over again today and you had to pick an area to focus on, what would it be?
Working in this area of at the edge of knowledge, where you are seeing the possibilities of new ways of addressing real existential threats, is something which I think, if I was starting out now, or if I was advising anybody as to, well, what career do you want to get to follow? I think look for an area where you think you can make a difference. For me, I've always been interested in healthcare, in the development of socially just responses to unmet medical and medical needs. It would be a tragedy if the work that has gone on in genomics, in genomic medicine, were to evolve into medicine for the rich, not medicine for everybody. So, I think, whether it's in the policy, the advocacy field, or whether it's in the hands-on wet biology of doing the research and the development, I think I would look for something where I thought I could make a difference. But frankly, you very rarely have that opportunity, you know,
Right.
that insight as to where things are going to go. When I started with Genetic Alliance, you know, over a quarter of a century ago, genetics was this obscure corner of the
Right,
health
right.
field. And what interested me was the fact that it
Had so
there
much
was it had
promise.
potential,
Yeah.
but essentially I was like the person who was sitting on top of the volcano when it erupted.
Right.
You know, we knew there was a potential volcano there, but we didn't know when it would go off.
Right.
So you know, I was lucky in that sense that I was in the right place in the right time to hopefully have made some sort of a difference in some very small way. I think, you know, look for where you think you have the chance, and go for it.
Great.
You know, there are always reasons not to do something. You know, but
Find what really
find
motivates you.
find what turns you on, what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, and like you, I mean, you say you were lucky sitting on the volcano, but equally, it sounds like some of the work at Genetic Alliance kind of can precipitate change in a way, right? You're not, you do want to ride, you know, you're subject to the broad changes of society, but equally you can put yourself in a position where you say, actually, we can make a difference as a group on something that's really important, and you know, to each of us in our small way can kind of push towards the direction. If you think genetics has promise, or you think genome editing is the future, then you can actually be one of the people who contributes to that change.
Yeah, but always remember it's a collaborative venture. You can do so much more if you work together than if you go head to head. I often think it's like a dance troupe. You know, in a dance troupe, everybody has got a different role, but everybody knows what everybody else's role is, and they work together, and the result is a harmonious and aesthetically pleasing outcome. Similarly, in healthcare, you know, we all have got different roles, but if we work together, then the outcome will be hopefully aesthetic and harmonious, but it will certainly produce greater benefits for a larger number of people than if we're at each other's throats and trying to keep our knowledge to ourselves.
Well, great. I think that's a perfect way to close off. Hopefully some of the knowledge here today will spur some people to change what they do or inspire them a little bit. So thanks very much. We really appreciate all your candid thoughts and experience and patient-centric research and support in rare disease.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Great. Thank you all for listening to the podcast. As always, you can send us any feedback, including questions you have or other guests you'd like to see on the show, or anything else that's on your mind, to podcast@sonogenetics.com. If you like the podcast, we'd really love it if you could share it with a friend and leave us a review on wherever you listen to your podcasts. Then finally, feel free to visit our website, sonogenetics.com, for more information, or blog posts, or some of the research projects we're running right now. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.